Well, in the election aftermath of a Liberal shutout in Alberta and Saskatchewan, a movement of yet-to-be-determined staying power has emerged in Alberta to declare the West wants out. To reality check what's going on and whether Wexit is here to stay, two big voices from the prairies join us. Brad Wall is a former premier of Saskatchewan. He's in Saskatoon and in Calgary. We're going to connect, if we haven't already, with Bret Wilson. He's an Alberta entrepreneur and very colorful social media commentator. I'm going to start with you, Brad, while we're fighting to get Bret hooked up here. Wexit, is this a budding political force in the image of the Reform Party, or do you think it's a bit of a supernova that's going to fade to black quickly?
Well, I don't think the country's well served to dismiss this movement or others like it that are moved from Western alienation to separatism. Let's be clear, there's an Ipsos poll out today that still shows the vast majority of people in Alberta and Saskatchewan support being a part of this country, support being a part of Confederation. But a large number, 1 in 3 Albertans, are saying that they probably call themselves separatists, in a fairly large sample poll by a reputable pollster, and about 27% is the number in Saskatchewan. And so the message to, I think, the federal government specifically, but to Canada, is that, look, the majority of people on the prairies obviously are proud Canadians, but we're frustrated. They are frustrated. And I think the federal government can respond. I think you have 2 premiers in Kenny and Moe that have already indicated, look, there are some specific things that could be done that will help alleviate this, will be good for the economy, can put people back to work and bring some fairness and balance back into the relationship. And it remains to be seen how the Prime Minister will react to those specific requests. I wrote about them in a National Post column not long ago, some ideas of what those requests might be, some examples, and it remains to be seen. But it's serious, Don. This is not the usual suspects, I guess I'll word it that way, that perhaps you would have seen at a Western Canada Concept rally years ago. This is a broader group, and the feeling is deep. And so I think there is the opportunity for Canada, if the federal government responds to what I think are reasonable and achievable requests from the prairie provinces.
Well, you and I have talked when you were really frustrated when Energy East was terminated, the pipeline that would have brought Alberta oil all the way to the Atlantic coastline. But I'm curious, how would a separate West benefit if its resources become a landlocked sovereign island, and the only way to the coast is through a pipeline owned by another country called Canada, and you're not part of it?
Well, I mean, that's the question that people are asking of those who are advocating for separation. How does it work? What's different about being landlocked within a larger country versus being landlocked if somehow you got to be your own country? And so, you know, that's probably why it hasn't picked up any more momentum. Although, like I said off the top, I think it's important that we not dismiss the sentiment. I mean, consider what's happening. And Don, I've always appreciated the fact that you spent a long time in Calgary. And so you've brought, I think, to your reporting now that you've announced that at least this manifestation of your journalistic career is coming to an end sometime in December. You've always brought Western sensitivities and a perspective of the West, but I'm not sure I'm not sure we see that from all sources. What has happened in Western Canada, just in the energy sector alone, is over 100,000 jobs have been lost. Imagine if that happened to a sector important to the center of the country. And then on top of that, there's the equalization fairness. There would be frustration, to be sure.
All right. I've got Bret Wilson. I got to ask him, Bret, you're very colorful on social media, which is always very entertaining, but I want you to talk about Wexit. Do you see this thing as having growth potential, or does it need a real injection of gravitas from some political operative? What does it need to go from movement to political force?
Well, I look at the picture a little bigger than just Wexit. There's a whole lot of pots that are simmering. The Wexit pot is boiling right now, for sure, but it's one pot. And I think the comment that the former premier made was that there is a sentiment in the West that people are underestimating. And so as much as Wexit is just one voice, and it's gaining some traction, and it's written a letter to Kenny, and it's demanding some things, it's not a large voice as yet. I think the greater voice is the one that'll come when people start to realize the swing in the sentiment in the West is so overwhelming with one of frustration. And whether we end up with independence or separation, 2 different concepts in my mind, we need to restructure the formula that we live under.
All right. Help me understand that. How does independence and separation look differently? Or what's the difference?
Well, independence to me is it's the format that Quebec has adopted, where they've got their own independent form of Canada Pension Plan, of healthcare, their own independent way of bringing people into the country, their own independent way of governing themselves. That's very different than separation. And separation is a fairly draconian move. It means setting new policy and frameworks and borders and a whole lot of things. And as former Premier Wall said, you know, whether we're a landlocked province or a landlocked country, we're still landlocked. So setting the terms of how we connect. Remember, there was a big dust-up not that long ago between BC and Alberta over shipping oil and shipping gasoline. And the province of BC went to court to ensure that they would get gasoline and to ensure that we wouldn't ship more oil. I mean, the hypocrisy is overwhelming. And so whether we're an island as a country or an island as a province, we're still an island.
That's interesting. Brad, I can't remember if you were premier at this point in time. Remember Stephen Harper wrote the notorious firewall letter? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
But, you know, the firewall concept, is that something you can see taking shape here, that the provinces take steps to insulate themselves in areas that they have jurisdiction over?
I do. I think those are steps that can be taken.
Yes, very much so. The firewall. Go ahead, Brad.
So, sorry. I think that's a possibility. I think first what needs to happen is we need to see the Prime Minister's reaction to Premier Moe's request to deal with certain issues and Premier Kenney's, when, you know, basically they are an equivalency for the climate change plan in each of the prairie provinces, which by the way, both of them have a price on emissions. They have a price on carbon, and for heavy emitters, imagine that's sometimes absent from parts of the federal plan. I think they'd like to see a rebate from equalization payments that continue 5 years into the downturn on both provinces, and a rebate can actually happen. There's something called I think it's called the Fiscal Balance Fund, or there's a technical term within the equalization program that allows for provinces that continue to pay in to get some money back. I think Bill 69 could be amended and TMX could be built. Those four things, I think, would preempt a lot of the emotions that we're seeing and the frustration they've been asked for by the premiers. And so now the Prime Minister is going to respond to them. And then my view is this, and I'm guessing, I'm observing like all of us now, but I'm guessing if the Prime Minister does not respond, the federal government doesn't act on any of those requests, then the next steps, some of which Bret's just canvassed, are possibility, including CPP. And if Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are the youngest provinces, get out of CPP, that has a material effect on the rest of the country and the rates that everyone else pays and the health of the program. So that's one example of the kind of thing that Bret's talking about.
Okay, Bret, help me see how Trudeau can listen and deal with these concerns, or is that ship left port already? Is the animosity too deep against Trudeau that a solution seems highly unlikely?
Well, the animosity may not change, but actions can speak louder than words. And so if we can get, as was hinted, if we can get TMX actually built, there's talk of it. I mean, until it's actually pumping, it's not built. And likewise, a little bit of care and concern over the fact that, for example, Encana and a couple of other companies are exiting Canada. The Prime Minister breached ethical protocols to protect 9,000 jobs for a company that may or may not have lost jobs. Encana's left the country, and we've got a parliamentary secretary sending a note saying, gee, no, we need action. And the political rhetoric has come to an end. And that's really why the pots are boiling, not just Wexit, but there's a lot of pots that are simmering, ready to boil in the conversation of, and again, whether it's my definition of independence or other people's definition of true separation, we need something different than what we have now.
Brad, well, just a final point to you. Saskatchewan's angst is deep and similarly separatist as Alberta, or is it different?
It's deeper than I've ever seen it. Again, I'm referencing the Ipsos poll today, large sample, both provinces, 33% separatist sentiment in Alberta, 27% in Saskatchewan. Typically, back to the first sort of wave of Western alienation in the early 1980s around the National Energy Program, I think the order of magnitude of separatist sentiment in Alberta was much greater than Saskatchewan. And so now we've seen if there's a gap, if you can call it that. We've seen it close, and there is a great deal of concern. I'd say it's a little bit more intense in Alberta, but it's much more intense in Saskatchewan and close to where it's at in Alberta. And remember, for those who are obviously still committed Canadians, I think Bret's used this term before on some of the tweets that I've read. Even those who obviously aren't supporting separatism at this time, they're frustrated Canadians, they're frustrated Federalists. And so I think that's why the next number of weeks and months, as we see the federal government respond to the specific and reasonable asks of both of the premiers, is going to be important. They haven't asked for anything that would require any messing with the Constitution, which we basically have an unamendable Constitution in this country. So I think what they've asked for is achievable, and I think the ball's now in the federal government's court to see what might happen next. But it is real out there. The frustration is real.
I got to get you on a last word here, Bret Wilson. Next step, federal government, what has it got to do?
Well, move. Get TMX rolling and show some respect for the West. Again, it's hard to articulate one thing. Premier Moe and Premier Kenney have both given lists of things that they want done. There's got to be action. Enough of the talk, action.
Okay, we'll see what happens. Thanks for your conversation. It was a great conversation. We'll be talking again.
Look forward.
Thanks, Tom.